First of all, welcome to this new webinar. The title of today's webinar is Enhancing Resilience, Integrating Local Wisdom and Vernacular Construction. Today we are very happy to have our colleagues from Miyamoto International that will explain a little bit about their experience and how to approach and tackle these different objectives of improving resilience, but at the same time guaranteeing the heritage architecture. Also, we are going to see some specific examples in different countries. Today, we are very pleased to have Adriana and Dave here for this presentation. Adriana is an architect and an urban planner graduated from UC Berkeley. She is leading Miyamoto's urban resilience and rehabilitation practice. Adriana has worked in different countries around the world, and she has worked in the private sector, in academia, and the United Nations before. We also have Dave. Dave is leader of Miyamoto's international shelter and settlement work. He has worked in humanitarian response of different types of disasters, mainly in Asia Pacific region, and he has provided expert consultation with different international organizations, including the World Bank, USAID, UN agencies, and different NGOs. Before giving them the word, just to mention that as you all know, we have a series of upcoming webinars. We have planned for September webinar in the framework of the Mediate project. This one is titled Multi-Hazard Interaction, Cascading Impacts and Indicators. This will be delivered by Christopher White, Camilo Lafranconi, Marcelo Arosi. And we also have scheduled another webinar for October that we will deliver together with our colleagues from Tsinghua University, in particular with Professor Dongping Fang and Professor Nan Li, and co-delivered as well by Sai-Shang Li, a postdoctoral research fellow here in the UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Engineering. The title of this webinar will be Data-Driven Approaches to Enhancing Infrastructure Resilience. So now I will give the word to Adrian and Dave and thank them again for joining us and for delivering this interesting work.
Thank you, Rafael. Let me just share the screen. There we go. And let me see if we can. Oops, give me 2 seconds. So please do let me know if you can see the screen properly.
Perfect.
All right, wonderful. Okay, well, wonderful. Well, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to share some of our experience at Miyamoto. Just wanted to give a very quick background. We'll be sharing this presentation alongside Dave Hodgkins. But wanted to give you a quick background on Miyamoto prior to handing it over to Dave, and then I'll take over the last part as well. So we are, Miyamoto International is a global engineering and humanitarian, a global engineering firm with a humanitarian focus. We have substantial experience on disaster risk management. We have over 75 years of experience and offices around the globe, as you can see. And with this experience working in post-disaster environment, that really enables the firm to develop and implement not only effective responses and early recovery, let's say processes, but also looking at kind of long-term development plans. So we have quite a bit of, let's say, areas of expertise. We're able to bridge the humanitarian assistance with the long-term development and really can have a more comprehensive, let's say, a series of resilience services that span from engineering to planning to policy. So we really work with multidisciplinary teams and work in an interdisciplinary manner in that sense. So our areas of expertise can range from housing, the shelter and settlements that Dave leads, for example, urban planning and urban rehabilitation, which I lead, to, as we mentioned, community engagement, behavioral change, policy and planning. And one thing to note that's particularly important for this presentation is that we are then able to provide technical assistance throughout the disaster management cycle. So everything going from assessment of damage, right, to recovery, to mitigation and preparedness. And this we do, as we'll dive into this, you'll see how we leverage kind of local wisdom and vernacular practices within our approach. So we will talk about two different areas, actually spanning that self-recovery, more, let's say, humanitarian assistance and recovery side, to then more preparedness and long-term development. I'll hand it over to Dave, who will talk a little bit more on the self-recovery examples, and then I'll take over to touch on some examples on the preparedness side and long-term development. So with that, over to you, Dave.
All right, great. And so next slide. Yeah, hi, I'm about 25 years working in disasters around the world. Joined Miyamoto about 4 or 5 years ago and lead their shelter and settlements sector. And I'm part of the Miyamoto's, as well as working on development projects. I've just spent the last week or two up in Jakarta working on a risk reduction project that we're doing in Jakarta, a neighborhood approach to risk reduction in urban settlements in Jakarta. But one of my primary roles is I'm part of the Miyamoto humanitarian assistance team. So I'm involved in our rapid emergency response team. So for example, in the Morocco earthquake last year, I was there within a few days of that earthquake. Miyamoto was on the ground, and we were traveling around that affected area, looking at what fell down and why, and what stood up and why. Miyamoto released quite a detailed report on the damage in that disaster, and identified this the sort of key components of what caused damage. And it was really, really interesting when we looked at those communities. If we got right up into the highlands, right up in the top of the mountainous areas of Morocco, into the high Atlas mountains there. And this is, you know, when we talk about out of Africa, it's out of the high Atlas mountains, right? Like this is the start of humanity, and some of the earliest sort of ancient stone construction that you see. Up in those remote valleys, we saw some stuff that survived very well. But as we moved down if we got into the cities like Marrakesh, we also saw things survive very well, where you've got enforcement of the National Building Code. But in between, we've got this sort of areas where you've got this loss of vernacular knowledge and this ad hoc mixture of building materials, and which led to a lot of the damage. And then also this sort of soft building in soft soil valleys. So many of the areas that were actually most damaged by the earthquake are areas that end up becoming almost like satellite villages of the urban environment. So while we think of the higher Atlas Mountains as remote, and everybody talks about them as being remote, this village that you can see in the middle, the central photo here, it's actually only about an hour and a half drive from Marrakesh. So it's in the remote Atlas Mountains, but it starts to act as a satellite village or a satellite suburb of the city, and people start bringing back components of modernity and mixing them together. And you can see in this particular example, this is a small hill, in a very soft soil hill, sticking up quite near the river, that has been built up and totally and utterly destroyed. The only buildings left standing were these very, very modern solid concrete buildings. It's hard to see in that photo, but that was a completely dense city, little town. So all the few buildings you see standing, that entire hill was covered in buildings of that size. We also saw that, you know, as those modern elements are being brought back, they're brought back in ways where the knowledge, the traditional knowledge is lost, but the new knowledge about modern building techniques isn't brought in. So you can see this is a classic, one of the primary causes of failure that we saw there. You can see on the right hand where we see these buildings surviving, and there's all these little details in there that we as vernacular engineers who are used to looking at vernacular damage can see as good practice. And then when we looked at these buildings that have fallen down, sorry, actually, would you mind going back to the last one, Audrey? Sorry, if you jump back to that one, yeah. So if you look at the building on our right-hand side there, you can see those very large cornerstones that are being used there to tie the two corners of the building together. We can see the very large lintels spreading over the window cavities. We can see that the stones in there have been shaped, and they're very angular, and they're long, skinny stones. When we look at the buildings that fell down, we can see these very round stones, and in amongst that, we can see these concrete elements. So, for example, the building that interesting, it's hard to even describe it. The village on our left, That's a collection of probably 100 houses in there with small gangways and laneways that are, you can't even disseminate and see what was a building compared to another building. It's that mishmash of these, you know, these peri-urban satellite villages using, you can see those concrete blocks in there, in that base wall construction there, and you can see a couple of concrete slabs and bits of concrete elements in there mixed up with stone. So, you know, partial concrete frames with these round stones in between. The concrete frame's not strong enough to hold the building, and the round stones are too round and they fall out, and then the whole building falls over. Whereas you can see on the right, much more preserved knowledge and therefore a much better performance. The next slide, if we jump into the next one, Andrew, yeah, so here's a great example that you can see where we're still seeing, even in these remote villages that performed pretty well. And so there we can see some lovely details, architectural details that have allowed those buildings to survive. An example would be the floor joists there that are poking through the wall. They're not ending in the middle of the wall. In a lot of the newer buildings, people have lost that knowledge and they've ended the floor joist in the middle of the wall. In fact, on the right-hand side, you can see two buildings built side by side. One of them is a much older building, the one on the right, and you can see that in that older building, they've lent the wall in. The whole wall itself is leaning on about a 2-degree angle. When stone and mud buildings are the oldest buildings in the world, right? Like this is ancient architecture, and they, you know, buildings in this area have survived hundreds of earthquakes in the past. And part of that is that in an earthquake, stone and mud buildings fall apart. But if they're leaning in, it's very hard for them to fall apart. So they're just that little 2-degree slope that you can see on the wall on the right makes that part of the building much stronger than that vertical wall of the new element. So we actually met the guy who worked on the old element when he was a child. He did the second story on that element. And we met, and he built the element on the left as an adult for the owner of the building. Unfortunately, that photo doesn't capture the furthest end of that building, which is actually then broken. You can see in this new building on the left, those floor joists aren't coming through the wall. And so in an earthquake, they smash into the wall and push it over. So it's these little details that we're able, you can see the component on the right, you can see those big stones, cornerstones holding the corners together. We can jump, I don't know if you can see my mouse there, I don't think you can, but where the line of those two buildings joining together, you can see there isn't any cornerstone on the left hand of that line. And there is cornerstones on the right hand of the older element. So for us, one of the tricks that we're trying to do is come in and say, okay, what stood up and why? What are the key parts, components of these buildings that help them survive? And where we're seeing damage, why are we seeing that damage? What's occurred to make that damage occur? And let's pull that out. And then let's sit with the oldest possible stonemasons and builders that we can find, talk that through with them, document what they know to be best practice, ratify that from our global experience, and then help re-disseminate that knowledge to the younger generation. You know, this becomes particularly important in areas like these remote villages where, you know, the area is quite denuded. The area is getting very hot. Climate change is reducing rainfall. Income potential in these remote areas is diminishing. But there's still people hiking through those mountains. So this heritage architecture is taking on a new meaning in terms of a livelihoods opportunity in the area. So the more we can pull back and say, let's not introduce modern concrete structures, let's preserve this beautiful remote villages and help people understand their own architecture and why it was from day one designed to resist earthquakes. Then we can see this preservation of traditional vernacular knowledge, and that is already earthquake resistant. So it's not like we're inventing earthquake resistance for these vernacular buildings. It's more like we're documenting best practice, pointing out poor practice, and then sharing that from what we've seen all around the world. So next slide. The Turkey earthquake, that's a really interesting example. So when we jump into Turkey and we're talking, I really like it because when we talk about vernacular housing, what is the vernacular of the areas affected in Turkey? And the vernacular is multi-story construction. It's multi-story, urban, steel, concrete construction. So we actually go through the same process. We go through the same process where we're sitting down and saying, what stood up and why? What fell down and why? What's best practice? What's worst practice? How do we document those? And how do we disseminate and encourage people to do best practice and not do worst practice? It's interesting, you can see there the steel, the deformed steel poking out of those concrete elements in the damaged building that's there. What we found in Turkey was that in Turkey, the building code was updated in the late 90s, early 2000s, came into force in early 2000s. Prior to that, there wasn't any earthquake resilience built into the building code. So we saw some of the very classic things that we know, for example, when you're building in an earthquake-prone area, it's important that the bits of steel wrapping around the columns are bent back around to 135 degrees. We call that the seismic hook. If they're only built around to 90 degrees, they can very easily pull apart. We saw that as a common point of failure in the buildings, in the traditional vernacular, in the modern vernacular that fell down. So I just want to, so the word vernacular refers to the language of architecture of the area. And if we work into these areas, the language of architecture is very modern. Interestingly, in the Turkey earthquake, you also see these huge towers. You can see that tower standing in the middle of there. I was there again in week 1 of that response, wandering around the towns like Hatay that were totally destroyed, and you would still see these incredible towers standing up. Now, those towers don't have any steel and they don't have any concrete. They're working on allowing the stones to move and dissipate energy throughout the construction. So again, we were able to look at heritage buildings there, traditional buildings built in stone and mud, and look at why they failed and give advice on that, as well as the work that most of our work there was working on repairing, assessing damage and giving advice on repairing apartment buildings. This is another example. This is the sort of work that we were doing there. So we did a bunch of that sort of documenting best practice. In that case, we ended up assessing about more than 20,000 housing units or apartments, coming back and assessing them, looking at the damage, documenting what were the common points of failure. From there, developing bills of quantity for how to repair those and giving advice directly to communities so they could get on with self-repair. Whether or not they got money from the government or an NGO, they could then have the skills and the tools to go on with self-repair. We then developed public outreach programs that then outreach and shared that knowledge to more and more and more people. So again, it's always for us, it's about, okay, it's this fundamental attitude towards disaster response, which is, it's not my disaster, it's not my house, it's your house, it's your disaster, it's your recovery. How do we support you with the technical advice and guidance? And if we can, some cash to get on with that recovery and repair. I want to give an example, just jumping a little bit back to Morocco or some of the other work we've done in stone and mud. If you have a stone and mud wall, I'm trying to think if I can see with my hands, but we have a stone and mud wall, a corner in a stone and mud wall, and it cracks and it comes apart. So yeah, it would look like that. It's cracking and coming apart. What tends to happen in earthquakes is the broken bits of stone will fall down in here. And as the continuing aftershocks occur, it just slowly but surely wedges the building apart. People who don't have the right information will tend to just fill that hole because it's letting air in, it's letting rain in, just fill it in and patch over it. Whereas what they really need to do is restitch the corner together, put cornerstones back in there and stitch back over it. Because if you just fill that gap in, as minor earthquakes happen, it will slowly fall back down and slowly but surely wedge the building apart. And so basically what I'm saying is that poor repairs can cause more damage than good repairs that cost the same. So for us, it's about how do we give you that advice and that guidance that helps you not do something silly and do something clever? And how do we make sure it's written in ways or produced in ways that you could see around you? The Afghanistan earthquake 2022, that was a lot of fun. Again, Kit Miyamoto and myself, we were on airplanes very early on in the field, right up in the Taliban-controlled heartland, up on the border with Pakistan there, looking at these traditional vernacular houses up there. So the traditional housing stock in that area is these large courtyards with these very tall walls that you just saw. Now, those outside courtyard walls can be up to 5 meters in height, 6 meters in height, and they're just made from earth. So there's nothing else. And you can see the photo in the last one, in the last building you saw was one that survived the earthquake. And this is one that didn't survive the earthquake. Now, that's what gets really interesting when you start to say why. I'm sorry, I do want you to jump back again, Adri, just so I can point out one detail there of the why. And what you can see there is they've leveled out the forces of the earth at the bottom there with stones and created a flat point throughout the building, right around the base of the building, which ends up being a rocking point. So they've created a flat level surface that those walls can rock on, that they can move on. And in fact, if you look at the very top corner of that building, you can see a vertical crack just forming there to the right of the building at the width of the wall. I don't know if you can see it, just to the right at the center of that wall, where the building has cracked a little bit. And that's just to do with that rocking movement that occurred in the building. So I jump forward into the next picture. Now, where we see building failure here, that again was really interesting. So here, what we saw, again, that same thing that I spoke about before, these are buildings that have a timber framed roof and then with earth put on top of it, where those timber frames go through the wall, they can, in an earthquake, they can slide backwards and forwards, and this acts as a seismic dampening mechanism. Where they don't go all the way through, as the earthquake happens, this wall gets hit by those roof beams, it gets pushed over, and we see building failure. So again, this is one of those things where we came back and we could identify what stood up and why, what fell down and why. In that particular earthquake, we came in partnering with one of the UN agencies. So down on the bottom corner there, you can see one of our colleagues from IOM. We came in, we looked at buildings that had stood up. Yeah, and again, the building at the top there, you can see those lovely rafters poking through the roof. We started documenting what had worked, what didn't. We started documenting the housing typology, how people lived in that space, what shelter meant, what housing meant to those communities. Where my colleague on the bottom corner there, you can see behind him, all those big walls have stood up fine. You can see that the building just to the left of his face, the roof has completely collapsed and fallen in. And on the ground there, you can see the timbers and bamboo elements that have been salvaged by the community to rebuild those roofs and elements. So it's again this process of documenting best practice, advising people not replicating worst practice. Next slide. So this is, I love this slide. One of the things that we're very aware that, you know, the classic sentence that an earthquake is not a disaster. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. There's natural events that become disaster because of sociological reasons that lead to poor construction, poor urban planning, poor preparedness. These are the things that turn a natural event into a disaster. So for us coming in and analyzing, well, what's working, what's not working, and now and understanding what was best practice gives us the answer to making sure that a disaster doesn't occur again. It's not the technology that was the problem, it's the sociological stuff. So what we could see here, we could fly over these areas in helicopters and we could see, this is a classic example where you can see that courtyard construction, these big tall walls that allow for privacy, you know, 5-6 meters tall, half a meter to a meter thick, and then little rooms built off the side of those walls. Now, this is a really interesting sociological sort of pattern of living. It means that in those rooms, you've got different families or different makeups of families living in one room. There could be a couple of men living in a room, or women or children, or families in different rooms. Some rooms are used for kitchen, some are used for storage. But though within one compound is one sort of extended family. This means that women who are living in those rooms, when they come out into the open courtyard area, in this society, those women can't be walking around and can't be seen publicly, but in the courtyard, they can be. It also means that there's no secret spaces there. There's no buildings that could form a protection risk if they wandered behind them, and they weren't everywhere. They're visible from everywhere within the courtyard. So this is a space that allows women the freedom to move around in a very strict Islamic community. So it's that sort of sociological understanding that we're looking at. The other thing you can see there is that in that photo is that people are already getting on with self-recovery. The roofs of those buildings had collapsed. You can see on the compound on the right, they've put their timbers back. salvage their materials, lived in their tents, salvage their materials, put those timbers back, and they're about to rebuild their earth roof. In other one, the compound on the left there, you can see they've already done that. At the moment, they're still living in their tents because they're a bit scared of the earthquake, but they'll quickly return to those buildings. And that understanding that sociological makeup of what is a house became really important. Yeah, the next slide's great, Audrey. In that slide, you can see, so that's a very simple graphic that we developed to explain how those buildings were working from a seismic engineering point of view. We actually did high performance engineering models, 3D models, and tested the performance of those earth and stone elements. We looked at the frequency of the earthquake, which is in that area is a very short, sharp frequency earthquake in a very hard stone soils. And then these big walls that can't move at the speed of the earthquake. So they end up rocking very slowly on their base, on that stone base that we saw in that initial slide. But the inner courtyard walls are shorter, thinner, lighter weight, and they rock out of sync with the major walls. And then we have this seismic dampening mechanism that happens with the timbers penetrating through all. So what we could do is, and this is actually really modern high performance seismic dampening system. So what we could do is look at the vernacular, the traditional, assess it, look at what stood up, analyze it, do computer modeling, high level performance engineering testing on it, figure out whether this was suitable for the earthquake risk in the area, which mostly it's likely to be because it evolved there. And then work out what's best practice and what's worst practice. In those areas, what we could see was that one of the biggest impacts of the war, the Afghan war, is that the traditions of construction had often dissipated as people went off to war and also brought back modern, different building materials. They just forgot some of their traditional building practices. So we could document the key points around there. In this particular disaster, we came in with IOM, did those rapid analysis, and then we were embedded into the cluster, the shelter cluster, and we trained all of the other UN agencies and cluster partners on how to assess vernacular damage and how to repair and train people on. So we trained engineers and then we trained masons. We worked with Cratere, which is an earth construction specialist organization based out of France. So we worked with them to look at the mud technology. And we sat down with the masons in the field and recorded what they were doing and what was best practice with them, and then disseminated that knowledge. So these were these practical training programs that we developed in Afghanistan. These are just examples of the sort of materials that we developed for engineers. These key, what are the other concepts? Sorry, if you come back one slide, sorry, Adri, thanks. If you look at that, so you can see those key messages that have been developed down the bottom there. What we're trying to do is document back to people and say, it's rather than, I guess, NGOs after a disaster are a bit prone to say, okay, we're going to design your house for you. And it's sort of very condescending and can be very condescending and paternalistic. And instead of doing that, we're saying we don't really mind what shape house you build, but here are the key things that made houses fail or succeed in an earthquake. So what we're doing is recommending that you do these details and focus on these technical details. Now, what shape your house is, how big or small it is, what shape your rooms are, what color it is, that's up to you and your family and whatever suits you and your needs. But these are the points that are really critical and important to making sure it will survive an earthquake. And we'll reference that again with photos, with videos, showing what worked and what didn't, and then develop these trainings. Some of these training material that we're developing there is the more technical training material that we develop for engineers and also for the cluster partners, so the organizations themselves could understand what went wrong and why. Next. So these are examples. This is above is us in the field, Miyamoto staff in the field, actually training. So in this case, there is this is training people on how to make the large Pashka blocks. So if you looked at those initial buildings, they're actually made out of very large blocks that are sort of 2 meters in length, a meter high, a meter wide, or they're sort of solid blocks that are just stone and mud, nothing else. And this is us talking about and training people about how to lay out a building and how to, what is best practice. And again, there, we're using traditional masons from the area. We're speaking in local language. We're talking with people who who know how to build stuff. We've recorded their best practice, and then we're helping disseminate it in the most practical way. The photo down the bottom is us training engineers and putting them through a certified training. I personally love those hats and now own one. This stands in contrast that we saw some of the work we saw other NGOs do, where they said, no, we've got a pre-designed earthquake-proof solution. These are little 2-bedroom houses that were built by some NGOs in that area, some other humanitarian organizations out there. They've got a bedroom on the left, a bedroom on the right, and a central sort of open kitchen area. You can see, and they're designed to be pretty much bomb-proof. That was a village that got leveled and then rebuilt like this. It was a village of these beautiful compounds. We assessed the village. We said that about 75% of it was okay and could be repaired. Unfortunately, engineers who weren't so used to understanding vernacular construction and the housing typology came and built this instead. What we saw out of that also was that this doesn't, now you imagine you're an Afghanistan woman and you're living in one of those buildings, you can't go outside in public without being escorted by a male, and you just basically can't be seen out in public. So suddenly all the freedom of that family is destroyed. The social fabric of the family is destroyed, as well as this incredible loss of the vernacular of the area. When we were up in these remote mountain valleys, it was really quite extraordinary because we were in areas where we could see no signs of modernity. Some of these areas, because of the war, this really was the Taliban heartland. So nobody was getting in there and nobody was really getting out. So there's no roads in, there's no power lines, as you can see. There was just no access. So when we walked around those valleys, we just saw earth and timber and really natural building elements in these, I would say, one of the last remaining areas of pure heritage architecture. I would suggest that it should have been UNESCO heritage listed. It was so beautiful. It was really quite extraordinary. And instead now we have concrete boxes with engineers not understanding the vernacular, thinking that this is the solution to the earthquake. Again, I would come back and always say, it's not the building material, whether we build in bamboo, earth, stone, mud, it's not the material. It's understanding the culture of construction, understanding the risks, understanding the evolved vernacular traditional housing forms that exist in those areas, and work out how they're appropriate. In all the work that we do, and I'll speak to this as well, that Miyamoto does, we try to take this whole of settlements approach. And I don't know if people who've dealt with this, but what we're trying to do is come in and not just look at the buildings. Miyamoto is an engineering company. I'm a human ecologist by trade. Audrey's an architect. We have a diverse range of skill sets within our town planners, with different people within our organization. We try to do this analysis of the governance, formal and informal, the population, daytime, nighttime, how they live, the housing typology, how people live in houses. So in Jakarta, we're looking at high rise, low rise, etc. We look at the non-housing buildings and what their functions are within the community, the services that exist, how are people getting water, how are they treating water, how are they getting energy to cook or do their other things, what sort of infrastructure systems exist around there, what natural resources are available, what are diminishing, what can be increased and improved, how these communities are connected to the outside world, and how does all the work that we're doing affect these things, and how do all those things affect the community. So when we're giving advice to the community, we're trying to make sure that all of that is taken on board in our analysis of what is best practice in a response. At this point, do you want me to hand over to you at this point, Adri, or?
Yeah, that's perfect, Dave. Yeah, this is just the recap slide from the whole settlements approach, going back to the Afghanistan kind of reconstruction efforts, and looking and assessing, right, not only, again, the understanding that housing was very much looking at the compound structure, but also assessing kind of that natural and built environment, the risk and vulnerabilities, the social behaviors, just to be able to have a more integrated approach. And with that, just to link a little bit more to, as Dave mentioned, right, that whole settlements approach that permeates also into the work that we do around preparedness and long-term development. Just to give a couple of very quick examples, also on some of, let's say, that leveraging that vernacular and understanding of kind of those local practices and local knowledges, and that local knowledge that exists, we bring that over. So in some of the efforts, reconstruction efforts that we've had in Latin America. This is in basically the Ecuador Building Resilience Program, really focusing on bamboo structure and bamboo construction, as that was the vernacular in the area. But also, right, this is exactly what we did in a program called Prepare, which is really focusing on increasing kind of that preparedness of the community. So really increasing knowledge on seismic risk and strengthening the disaster risk management capacity, and kind of institutional, even disaster risk management capacity overall. We were working in 9 different countries. Looking back at Ecuador, right, part of that large focus had been on bamboo construction, and a very strong focus on really enhancing community resilience, right, through workshops, promoting awareness, building up that capacity around let's say bamboo construction. This was straddling not only, right, really looking at the community overall, so working with women and children as well in some of these workshops, but also, and then just very quickly, right, to state that it wasn't, right, and it's, as they've said, not necessarily a dogmatic perspective on this is the vernacular and this is what we're going to impose on you, but really looking at the accessibility, right, of these materials, that knowledge that exists, and really how can we enhance this. So the whole point is to speed up and support the self-recovery aspect, but also support, right, the community resilience aspect alongside. And in this case, right, some of the work that Miyamoto has done is also seeking that fusion of modern technologies and vernacular, and how to bring innovation on that sense. And thus really looking at, as we call, incremental retrofits that become very accessible to communities, where they can build up their own resilience through progressive reconstruction and strengthening of their structures and housing. And in this case, right, really looking at kind of that opportunity of bringing in different materials like bamboo, the esterilla, the bamboo fiber, wood strips, to enhance some of the, let's say, existing constructions that we're seeing in place. But I'll leave it there at kind of the scale. I really want to focus a little bit more on the urban scale as well, and just show how we also enhance resilience and climate adaptation, working through, right, let's say, leveraging also that vernacular in the landscape, right? So we really work through a system-based approach that acknowledges entire ecosystems, looking at multiple dynamics. So again, going back to this idea of the whole settlements approach. So looking at everything from infrastructure and connectivity and mobility to economic drivers, to use of space and local governance strategies. And we do this in order to bring up, let's say, urban planning strategies that enhance resilience and sustainability, but do it in a way where we can really, let's say, push forward community development while we tackle risk mitigation and we reinforce the ecologies and foster local economic development. So these are processes that put people, nature, and climate at the center of the approach. And in this, there's an importance to really integrate kind of that natural or landscape heritage, right, into the planning and design processes as a key component to build sustainability and resilience. You know, this has to do in many cases in embracing age-old technologies and local wisdom, and harnessing, let's say, the power of more low-tech solutions to enhance sustainability. So anything from passive design principles, where we're really taking advantage of just the existing surrounding and environment, right, and just creating opportunities to either you know, I don't know, create more cross ventilation, to create more in the urban planning, create urban designs that allow to the creation of higher shade, and thus reduce some of the, let's say, urban heat that's happening. So it's everything from passive design strategies to the use of sustainable materials as bamboo, earth, as we've touched upon, and the inclusion also of these nature-based solutions. So everything that goes from kind of that, let's say, green, blue infrastructure that we can start integrating to create resilience and really create, again, resilience through that weaving of local, indigenous, and vernacular practices, and in this case, really strong kind of understanding of some of these nature-based solutions and that local kind of landscape heritage that might exist. We tend to start part of the planning process really looking at a historical landscape analysis. So how did the landscape used to behave, understanding how urbanization and growth trends and urban development patterns have gone along. In many cases, we know that cities have grown disregarding, the ecosystems, minimizing permeability and water filtration potentials in the city. So really making the city very impermeable, which, as we know, right, with climate change, flood risk has been increased, and there are other kind of climate hazards that come to play that we really need to be aware about. So understanding how the landscape used to behave, and then relying on some of these natural, right, nature-based solutions to bring forth, let's say, different strategies that can have a combination of great infrastructure as well as green infrastructure, but looking at how can we start integrating these strategies within the landscape to help make it once again function adequately, and make it once again resilient. So sorry, let me go back to that previous slide just to show what this is actually a quick image of a project that's ongoing, where we are working in Central African Republic, looking at Bangui specifically, and doing kind of that historical analysis on the landscape and bringing forth kind of a macro perspective on some of these nature-based solutions and water management strategies in the city. This also kind of guides us then, understanding that landscape, right, and that natural heritage, and that guides us to have a more particular take on some of the urban planning strategies and as the example here shows. So the plan on the left is a plan, it's a strategic urban plan basically for 3 communes around the Nijili River, which is kind of that orange line that you see in the middle, in Kinshasa in the DRC. And part of the strategy here was not to follow in the communes the political boundaries that exist, but really look at the way that water moves through the city, identify the existing urbanization patterns, and really kind of develop these kind of planning strips. So you see them in green as kind of key areas to look at. So again, going beyond not looking at the political boundaries, but really understanding that the planning strategy here needed to follow, right, that urbanization pattern, but also that way that water was moving through the city in order to enhance the resilience. These communes, because they are close to the Nijili River, because they've been highly urbanized, a lot of informal construction as well, they are also extremely flood prone. So part of the strategies here and part of the take was, how do we bring in flood risk mitigation strategies from an urban perspective, but do it in a way that can also enhance community development and local economic development as well. The images on the right showcase one particular site that's part of this exercise. It also entails identifying within these strips potential locations and typologies, let's say, that can also be replicated throughout. So in this case, these were identifying natural runoff, let's say drainage, rainwater runoff areas, where we could start designing certain prototypes that would not only enhance the way that water could move across the site and obviously mitigate the flood risk, but could also start integrating through co-creation processes and participatory processes, an understanding of what the community expected, what the community needed, and thus creating multifunctional spaces where we're not only integrating those nature-based solutions as a resilience mechanism and really redefining how water moves in the city, but also taking this as an opportunity to, again, enhance kind of the community strategies along here. In this particular area, there's a very strong focus and existence of local organizations focusing on recycling. So part of the strategy and conceptual design brings in some of those potentials. So looks at integrating public equipment as a recycling plant, as well as integrating public space that can foster some of the community development. And this also brings us to, some of these solutions that integrated that we're leveraging really come from existing practices that we're seeing on the ground. This is really leveraging community-led informal solutions that currently exist, so that kind of intangible cultural heritage. In this case, we're seeing sandbags that were used for erosion control and water management. We're seeing detention ponds and rainwater runoff speed reduction strategies already in place. We're seeing vetiver grass plantings that were taking place for erosion control. So really looking at that existing knowledge within the communities and bringing it in to see how, we integrate it in our urban design, urban planning strategies as well, and really leverage kind of that intangible cultural heritage, knowing that will enhance that local knowledge, and not about necessarily imposing or parachuting in with, let's say, different ideas. So really focusing on that long-term sustainability aspect as well. And just as a last example of how, the vernacular and landscape heritage becomes a central component in our approach, I want to take you to another example, to Peru, more specifically in Lima, where we're working along 2 areas along the River Rimac, which you see here on the left and both on right. As you can tell, we have one very informal area up in the hill, and then one more consolidated area, let's say on the right side of the river. But again, very arid, very, very arid landscape. These are, extremely little urban greening. This is, again, one of the images looking at kind of that initial analysis of the landscape. So very little urban greening, as it is. Lima in itself has a very strong deficit of urban greening. This particular area was that was heightened. We have on the hill, we have a hard rock and soil that is very resistant to erosion on one hand, but with very little filtration and infiltration capacity, and water retention capacity. And then, of course, we have some, development that had happened along the river, in the natural floodplain, as well as interventions as the city grew alongside the river that really exacerbated the flood risk, let's say, vulnerabilities in the area. This image is one that shows kind of that evolution of the river course along the years. So we start at 1500s on the left, 1700 is the following image, along with then 1900s, and then 2020 is the last one. And as you see, right, that river loses kind of that natural path to become ultimately an additional highway, right, along the city center. So you see how it's channeled then and really kind of minimized, and all of these natural kind of movements that water was currently making really get eliminated as development, let's say the urban development evolved. And you see at the bottom kind of the evolution of that representation of the landscape and how gray it then starts becoming. And this obviously, once again, right, just noting how it's exacerbated some of that flood risk in the area. But in this historical analysis, also noting very interesting existing presence of pre-Inca water channels throughout the city. In this image on the right, you can see it starts creating, right, where the water channel still exists, it does create this natural oasis and ecology. So really a kind of almost like natural water management and greening for the city that, unfortunately, as the city continued to grow and continued to become, let's say, more and more impermeable, these water channels got covered up. So part of the strategy, and noting that some of that infrastructure is still very much in place, just covered, right, has been to recognize the existence of these pre-Inca channels, and to be able to recuperate them, see how we can bring them back into that urban fabric. And as you can note, this is very much part of the cultural heritage also of the city. These weren't just irrigation channels. You see the image at the top left. These were also channels, right, and spaces in the city that were used for recreation purpose, that were very much that part of life in terms of the day-to-day living in the city. And so part of the strategy or the approach does become recognizing these channels, see where we can recuperate them, as well as understanding and identifying different locations and different typologies along the city, as some of these images at the bottom right show of basically, especially like in the middle image, you see some of the cloisters where that urban greening is really taking place. And we see that there are a lot of cloisters in the city center, and these are spaces where the central urban plaza has like this smaller oasis, and trying to understand, okay, how can we start tapping into some of the existing potentials to really put forth then strategies that can integrate let's say, and reinforce the landscape, bringing back these pre-Inca channels as these green corridors through the city, being able to optimize these existing kind of green spaces and opportunities throughout the city and really create a network, an interconnected network that can enhance the urban greening, can enhance and address some of the water filtration aspects of the city, and can really kind of push forth that resilience overall. And, as just one concluding thought, going back and echoing some of what Dave said, and what we're seeing in some of these examples is really that recognition of building resilience really comes with part of that recognition of heritage. It really comes with part of empowering that self-recovery from people, as well as the preparedness aspect, allowing them to take a charge and giving the communities the necessary tools, right? Once we understand through the diagnostic of the area, through that whole settlements approach, and be able to hand over the necessary information to empower communities so they can take forth, right, their own, be it self-recovery or their own resilience enhancements. And so we definitely see that indigenous, right, knowledge and vernacular practices hold a very strong, let's say, influence in some of this. And I'm just using a quick image that was used for the Afghanistan earthquake to showcase why that local building culture is important, right? So really about leveraging existing resources, both in terms of knowledge as well as access to materials, acknowledging the use of space and the multiple dynamics that come to play, acknowledging and learning from, these existing kind of almost climate adaptation and passive design strategies that are already in place. And also acknowledging that there is an evolving culture, right? And a constantly evolving one, where it's not about mummifying necessarily practices and knowledge, but really about working with communities and enhancing some of that existing, but when necessary, right, bringing forth different solutions that can again leverage on the local knowledge and wisdom as well. And I will just take as a final slide an opportunity within this just to state, as we've mentioned, our research and development becomes an extremely important part of the work that we do, both on looking at some of this indigenous knowledge and vernacular, as well as in other cases. And we've currently launched an innovation challenge for climate resilient housing in communities that I wanted to showcase here. And this is looking very much at some of these, we are hoping to get other, let's say, strategies and innovations in looking at some of this vernacular indigenous practices to enhance, let's say, climate resilience in housing and communities. But wanted to share this as we're extremely excited to be part of this initiative. This is basically showing commitment to the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, PREPARE. And we will be consolidating an open source, basically a website, as well as a retrofit guide looking at some of these solutions to be able to share openly as well. So with that, I will leave it there, and just really want to thank you for your time, and really, excited to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for this interesting presentation. Thanks also to Dave. I think that the presentation was brilliant. We saw these interactions between the local building culture, but also with heritage architecture, how to improve resilience, having this systems approach, and all having in the center the environment, the climate, which is the main aspect. Now, I will give the word to our reactors. We have Professor Dina Dayala. She doesn't need introduction, but she is a full professor at the UCL in the structural area. She is the UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Engineering. We also have Dr. America Bendito here from UNESCO. She works as a specialist in the Disaster Risk Reduction Unit. She has worked in similar projects, and in particular in the built environment in Latin America and the Caribbean, the VERLAC project, that tries to enhance resilience in different countries in the region. And last but not least, we also have Jaime Erazo, who is Miyamoto's manager for Colombia, with a lot of experience in specific projects of risk reduction. So We will have some reactions from this panel, and then we will have the opportunity to open the mic from our attendees and to answer some questions. But in the meantime, if you have any question, there's also the Q&A section. So feel free to drop there your questions, and we will have more discussion at the end. So please, Dina.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for the introduction. And first of all, as a co-host, thank you very much to our speakers for this very fascinating talk, which covers many of the essential issues of the full process of preparedness, mitigation, and then recovery, reconstructions after an event. And I'm particularly grateful for the fact that you have covered both issues that relate to seismic hazard, but also to climate hazards, which in fact they are the focus of the chair as well. So with this, I would like to, I have possibly two questions that I would like to leave open to both of you. The first question comes from my personal experience of having done similar work, for instance, in Nepal or in Jordan and in many countries in North Africa, not least Morocco, where there is a continuous effort to let's say, collect information on the vernacular procedures and methods of constructions where they are still available, trying to understand how they have evolved in more, let's say, modern version, and then try to almost alert against further, shall we call it, miscegenations or evolutions in a direction that actually enhances risk and vulnerability instead of mitigating it and improving it. How do we make this sustainable, in the sense that how do we transfer this both in time and geographically to larger communities, so that the lessons learned are not lost after each event? Because I am sure that Miyamoto, within you are a private company, a large company, has a lot of let's say institutional memory or corporative memory, but the issue is whether that memory is then disseminated to other situations and reaches the people that let's say, need that information possibly well before an event occurs, and we trigger the study of the whys it worked or it didn't work. So I stop here with the first questions, and then maybe I'll go on to the second one.
Do you want me to have a go at answering that, Adri?
Yes, please go for it.
Sure, great. Actually, Dino, it's nice to hear that you also worked in Morocco and Nepal. I think a couple of comments there. When I look at Nepal, I was there in the earthquake in the first period of that, working as a technical advisor there as well. And we did the same thing, where we could walk around and look at the key things that caused buildings to fail and the key things that allowed them to stand up. And we could document that, and we ended up producing some literature around that and disseminating that literature. I think one of the, and that was disseminatable. So we, Miyamoto, like in Turkey, disseminating through social media, through all sorts of mainstream media, all sorts of places, disseminating things broadly. I do think one of the things we have to recognize is that vernacular housing is evolved housing. It evolved to suit the climatic risk. It evolved to suit the climate. It evolved to address the hazards in the area. It evolved to use the available materials and resources in the area. And it evolved to fit the culture of how people lived. And what a house means to people or what a building means to people within a society. So it's this combination of events, right? And we have to recognize that some of that stuff is changing. The climate is changing. People's definition of what a house is, what a house means, is changing. And I just wanted to share an example of that. When we look at Pacific Island societies, it's really interesting. In everywhere I've been in the world, when I'm dealing with earthquake-prone buildings, I can see braced elements in the construction. I can see braced roofs. I can see braced elements. When I go and look in remote areas where we're looking at cyclonic damage, I don't see bracing. And it's like, oh, why not? Because like it's such a logical thing to do. And the answer is because communities are relying on a concept of incremental failure. A wind comes along and it's a bit big and blows the roof off. But that's okay, you know, then next week we can put the roof back on again. And then a slightly bigger wind comes along and it blows the wall cladding off. That's okay, we can put the wall cladding on and we get back on with life. Slightly bigger wind comes along and blows the roof frame away, slightly bigger, it blows the wall frame away. At the end of the day, we've still got the floor, or at the end of the day, we've still got the foundation posts. That approach for incremental failure is a really clever disaster response mechanism, but it works really, really badly when you own a laptop, computer, and a fridge, and a television, and books, and all these other accoutrements of modern life, right? And so we have, one of the things we have to take in consideration is, what are the changes that are occurring in a society? What's the changing needs of a building and a house? What's the changing nature of risk? So just if we go into an area and we say, just as an example, I live in Java. We've got some beautiful heritage buildings here in Java. Joglos, Limassans, these traditional buildings that I've done a bit of work here with UNESCO on some of the disaster resilience of those buildings. They're great. They're self-cooling and ventilating and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But are they able to handle the heat waves that we're seeing right now coming along? Maybe they're not. So we've got this sort of challenge that we have, which is to say, what parts of that vernacular are still working, are still relevant, still suit people's needs, still suit people's the changing climate and the changing sociology of what a building means. How do we document that? How do we capture that? How do we check that it still resonates with people, that it still works with people? And how do we echo or reflect that back? How do we whiteboard that back to a community and allow them to understand that as an option, as a choice that they may want to think about? Understand the negatives, the positives moving forward. I built a little eco resort in Java, built out of traditional timber structures. Now timber's heavily, we're facing deforestation, timber availability is going down. Is that the building system moving forward? Maybe it's not for the average household, but maybe it's a vernacular we want to preserve in the way that I am, in accommodation facilities for tourists or something. So I think there's a bit of a combination there. That's one part of the answer, is understanding when that vernacular is still appropriate and when we want to replicate it. The other thing I would say is that in my experience of trying to message to people about vernacular or about disaster resilient housing, and particularly in the vernacular, but in anything else, the best way to do it is to keep things incredibly simple, focus on points of failure, points of success, and simplify that right down. We tend to be prone to draw these beautiful three-dimensional drawings with cutaway sections, and people don't know what the important points are. So focus just on the key points, and then as much as possible, back that up with photos, the visual images, photos and videos that people can just walk out the door after a disaster or walk out the door in their community and see that. Go, oh, that's what that is. That's really cool. I can see that. I can understand that. And I wanted to give another example about that. If I look at almost anywhere I go in the world, when I look at traditional timber houses, very commonly you have an eave that produces, that the roof hangs out past the wall to protect the wall from rain. And very commonly you have a strut that supports that roof coming out, a corbel or a strut, whatever you want to call it. In many, many, many traditional cultures, the bottom edge of that strut will be carved and with some intricate carving. And when we look at that, we go, why? There's so much work. What's it for? And from an engineering point of view, we can see that actually it creates a drip point. So if that's that strut holding the roof up, this intricate carving means that water running down here hits a carved point and drips rather than running any further. And then there's normally 2 or 3 of those drip points in the construction. This, if the roof leaks, if horizontal rain comes in and hits this strut, it won't flow down and rot out the post that's holding the building up because it's got these carved drip points. Now, when I talk to carpenters in the area, they would understand they understand the carving because their grandfather taught them it, or their grandmother or whoever it was, and they do it, but they don't understand the logic of why they're doing it. And when we have those conversations, we say, well, actually, that's got a huge amount of modern scientific credibility. That's really cool. It's an amazing thing to do. It's preserving buildings. It's very clever. Like these, the rocky mechanism, the seismic damping in Afghanistan earthquakes. It's clever. When we emphasize that, then we get resonance. We get people understanding it. So I think the simple imaging, the focusing on key points, the checking what resonates, and then understanding the changing nature of society, bringing those things together is perhaps, in some ways, I hope, answering that question.
Thank you.
And that can be pre or post.
Thank you very much, Dave. Yeah. I don't know, Adriana, if you want to add anything.
No, I think they've covered most of what I would point out. I think, and I would just add in one additional component in terms of how some of this key messaging does get replicated. I mean, Dave works very closely, right? Dave and team works very closely also with the shelter clusters. And some of the images that you saw for let's say the Afghanistan efforts, that was in direct, let's say, relation and collaboration with the shelter cluster, which hopefully creates a larger dissemination. So yes, the intent is for sure not to keep it in-house, but to be able to disseminate some of that information more broadly.
Thank you very much, Adriana. My second question was more about the finances of these efforts. Very often when you go in a reconstruction situation, of course, there will be some funds from the government, there will be private funding, people will have some choice, usually they are quite limited, and they will go for whatever they can do within the finances that they have. So how do we, and for instance, we have seen in Nepal, and we have studied that quite in details, that again, there were the reconstruction was all supported by the government through, of course, international donors as well. The money that was given to the individuals or to the nucleus, to the familiar nucleus, was related to a certain level of advancement of the project, but also that given that amount of money, only certain, let's say, footage, a certain amount, a certain level of footprint could be could be actually constructed, which was not necessarily very useful to the life and livelihood of the family nucleus. So how do we ensure that this level of knowledge and this level of understanding gets into the reconstruction guidelines at policy level before, so that they are safe, but they are also livable, and they are definitely livable, and that the finances for the reconstruction are realistic, given that, of course, the introduction of particular resilient details might not cost a lot much, but they might need some more thinking, and that thinking might cost some more. Yes?
Yeah, I can have an initial bash at that as well. I did quite a lot of work in Nepal. And if we look at the vernacular housing of most of the, there's a huge spread. We were dealing with these 2 earthquakes, one to the east of Kathmandu, one to the west, and we've got a whole range of different sociological groups up there in those high mountain groups, and semi-nomadic, nomadic, a whole bunch of stuff. But to spread a bit of generalization, and I apologize for it, because we also have urban and rural and modern and traditional vernacular, but a large percentage of the population lived in 3-story houses, where the bottom story of the house was, in winter, they kept the cattle there. In the middle story, they lived in it, and the heat rising from the cattle was part of what kept them warm. And in the roofs, they stored their grain and other materials for later. I had the great pleasure of walking around many and flying into many remote valleys, assessing the damage to vernacular housing in the area. What we could see was that I could walk into a village and just see side by side a building that had stood up and a building that had fallen down. And we could very quickly start to see the differences between those buildings. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. But in traditional the culture of Nepal, they have a national day of the snakes, and they talk about these snakes, and they have a beautiful image of these intertwined snakes. And they talk about the tensile strength of the snakes that protect your house. And we would go into people and say, oh, by the way, did you have any banding in your house that would hold those stone walls together? And, oh, I don't know what you mean, banding. Nah, I never did anything like that. Eventually, we cottoned onto this snake idea, and we realized that people were embedding pieces of timber into their walls as a snake. And the snakes had these special tensile joints to hold them together in these traditional structures. This was one of the key characteristics we could see in buildings that had survived and buildings that had fallen down, was these snakes. In many areas, just telling people about that was enough to remind them about it, was enough for them to rebuild. In other areas, we had to recognize that deforestation was the reason they weren't doing it anymore, as well as cultural shift, but deforestation was part of it. And we had to rethink what those snakes could be made out of and help people think about that and rethink about that. But what we did see was that through the World Bank, IMF, etc., funded recovery program, through the Nepalese government, the focus became on preset designs. There was an atlas.
That's what I was referring to, yes.
Right, there was an atlas of, I think, 36 different designs that you could build, and you had to build one of these, and you got incremental funding when you did the foundations and when you did It wasn't allowed to be 3 stories. It had to be 1 or 2 stories. It couldn't be any more. It wasn't culturally appropriate. It wasn't the heritage of the area. A huge amount of the traditional stone buildings, they're held together by friction. The weight of the building pressing on the stone stops the stones from sliding. Very critical part of the success of Nepalese buildings was the slate roofs. These heavy slate roofs hold the walls together and stop them falling apart. NGOs, Goodwilling, came in and said, oh, let's distribute corrugated iron. It was one of the biggest mass distributions of corrugated iron that I've ever seen in the world, and taking the weight off buildings and causing buildings to fall apart. So we saw some of the efforts that were happening were actually having a negative impact. And I guess what we also saw is that it took about 5 years for the recovery funds to get distributed, longer than 5 years. I think there's still people who haven't got those recovery funds. I went to a great lecture by a Nepalese architecture professor on the recovery process. People often got their money, built the little thing they needed to get more money, and then built the less, while in the background, they built their traditional house that they actually
wanted. How do we prevent that? How can we influence a different process?
Right. I'm glad that we're on the same page about that, Dinah. And I just wasn't sure everybody else had the same picture. I would come back and say that one of the biggest tricks is that we need to start. So, if I look at the shelter cluster and shelter actors 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they all came with a design. The one-room shelters of the Pakistan flood in 2010. There's so many examples around the world. They always came with that design. We need to get away from designing products and focus on designing processes. We need to help governments understand. So in the shelter sector, we say that shelter is a process, not a product. So it's coming back and saying, these are the key messages. Those bands are important. Now, whether you built them out of steel and concrete, you built them out of timber, you built them out of bamboo, whatever, they're really important. You've got to put that in your house. How many floors it is or how much shape it is less important. We have to I think we have to change the mindset of our sector so that we better understand that non-design based approach, process design, not product design based approach, and make sure from day one we're having that conversation with governments. Day one we're having that conversation with the finance agencies, because actually it's a hell of a lot cheaper. The Afghanistan model that we showed you, those steel reinforced concrete earthquake-proof bunkers were about somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 per structure. The totally repairing the vernacular compound with a whole bunch of families living in their traditional building was in the hundreds of dollars, using local materials, local labor. So if we get in fast enough, we stop people talking about object design and start and talk about shelterless process and the cost savings of taking that approach, I think we can influence. But we need to get people on the same song sheet. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly, and I'm sorry, when we talked about those key messages, I worked in the Tacloban cyclone response, where we developed the 8 key messages on safe reconstruction in timber. Actually, some of the messages I don't agree with, but what was really important was getting 200 different NGOs to sing from the same song sheet, to say the same thing, not confuse the community. And what was really important was we got up to the point where the government had their logo on it and they owned it. I remember sitting at the airport once, flying out of the country, and I sitting next to a woman, started talking to her, and she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm an earthquake specialist, disaster specialist. I work on safe reconstruction." She said, "Have you seen this really cool thing my government developed on 8 key messages for safe reconstruction? You should look at this. It's really clever. My government's amazing." So getting that sense of ownership of it within working to get that ownership of the government. But I think we need to recognize that getting everybody to sing from the same song sheet, having those common messages is stage 1. Then thinking about stage 2, which is what's the most effective, who needs those messages, in what form, and how do I best communicate that to them? That's another stage. So, like builders need the same message as householders. It's the same messages, but they need it in a very different format. They need it in a physical, hands-on, this is how I join those 2 objects together. Householders need to say, my house should have bracing. If it hasn't, it looks wrong. Talk to the builder. The builder needs to know, how do I put in bracing so it acts as both in tension and compression? So it's targeting of those messages, developing them, buying in earlier, pointing out that approach, that process-driven approach, is cheaper and more cost-effective and faster because it supports self-recovery. It happens faster because it's supporting people's own effort. And then thinking about the outreach of those messages once you've got communal buy-in on them. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adriana. I don't know if you want to.
No, I'll leave it there for this one. I think they've, again, that understanding shelter, and as we say, right, shelter and housing as process and not product, is definitely the key point that I would reinforce there.
Thank you very much. Rafael, back to you.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Dave and Adriana. So I will give now the word to America, so she can react and talk us about her point of view. Please, America.
Well, I would like to thank Adriana and Dave for this insightful presentation. Your discussions on the efficiency of risk reduction approaches that require minimal changes within impacted community. It's not only fascinating, but it's also incredibly relevant to our ongoing efforts to enhance resilience. I will also like to thank Rafael and Dina, in this case, organizing these interesting regular webinars and for inviting me in this occasion. In our rapidly changing world, the frequency and the intensity of disasters have been increasingly posing significant changes for our built environment. And as we strive to build more resilient community, it's imperative that we look to the past to inform our future. There is where local wisdom and vernacular constructions come into play. As Adriana and Dave highlighted, the key to successful safety and self-recovery lies in respecting and leveraging existing local designs and materials. This approach not only preserves cultural heritage, but also ensures that solutions are practical, sustainable, and readily accepted by the community. Integrating scientifically derived techniques with these traditional methods can significantly enhance the resilience of our built environments. At UNESCO DRR, we support our member states in building a global culture of resilience operating at the interface of natural and social science, education, culture, and communications. We take a multi-hazard and a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder participatory approach to consider the needs of the community, the environment, and the local conditions. And we cross-cut in 8 thematic areas, which 4 of them has been discussed and presented today: the built environment, nature-based solutions, DRR for culture and sites, and post-disaster recovery. While local wisdom and vernacular construction offer numerous benefits, they also come with challenges, which in our experience, some of them are the urbanization, the economic pressure, the globalization of construction standards that often leads to neglect the traditional methods, the lack of experienced masons in this type of construction, and the educational gap in teaching architects and engineers. But these challenges also come with opportunities. We need to formulate laws that encourage traditional construction, leverage local resources, and distinguish them from reinforced concrete buildings. We need to improve awareness of the importance of traditional construction, empowering communities through accessible methods of self-construction. We need to foster collaboration between architects, engineers, anthropologists, and the local community so we can develop innovative solutions, but respecting the traditional knowledge. Educational initiatives and policy support are also crucial. By promoting the value of local wisdom and vernacular construction through academic curricula and government policies, we can ensure that these practices are preserved and adapted for future generations. Let us continue to advocate for solutions that respect and build on rich heritage and local communities, and by doing so, we can create resilient future that honors the past while embracing the advancements of the present. Thank you very much again, Adriana and Dave. Thank you, Rafael and Dina. And I look forward to engaging to future discussions on this crucial topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, America. I think there are a couple of very interesting questions from the audience. And one, I don't know if Matthew Reiter, you would like to open your microphone and answer and ask the question. I think also we have lost Jaime, maybe, Rafa.
Yes,
Matthew,
Jaime,
if you can introduce briefly yourself and ask your answer.
Yes.
Your question. Sorry. Rather.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, hi, good morning. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Yes, and my question is, and it's applicable both to architecture, structural engineers, or even the site planning. And I guess my question is, how do you take the kind of the broad principles that you've worked with the local builders to kind of convey the engineering and architectural principles and kind of mesh that with the vernacular construction, but how do you adjust to the site conditions when it's actually being built and the builders are actually building it to kind of make sure that there is quality control kind of up to the last piece? So what's your experience, and this is for all the panelists, and what's the approach and what are the best approaches to this?
Yes, please, Adriana.
Happy to have a go.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm more than happy to have a go at that one because I think it's really interesting, and quality control is one of the great challenges that we as an engineering company face. All engineering companies face, right? Because often we're taking legal liability. We tell you to do something and you don't do it the right way, then there's this real sense that we're going to be legally liable, and it's one of the challenges I encounter all the time in the field. So, you know, the latest review of the performance of the shelter cluster globally, the shelter cluster last year managed to help 7% of the people that they targeted for assistance in disasters around the world. The percentage that they target is only the disasters where a global cluster activation occurred, which is a very small percentage of the global number of disasters. And within that very small percentage, it's only 7% of the number of people they chose to target to assist. Often that's only the most vulnerable. So, you know, in a disaster where 20 million people affected, they may have chosen to assist 1 million, a targeted assistance to 1 million, and that only achieved 7%. Now, that's a damning statistic. And it's a damning statistic because we're prone to want to design a solution for which we can be held accountable. And what that means is we don't do enough of just supporting self-recovery and recognizing it's not my house, it's not my disaster, it's somebody else's house, it's somebody else's disaster, it's somebody else's recovery. So the real challenge I would put back to you, Matthew, is the question of how do we help the other, and it's a question that's often worded as how do we help the other 97%? Because globally we help less than 3%. In fact, it's much worse than that because it's 7% of 10% of, you know, some small percent. I know in Indonesia alone, we had a couple of thousand disasters last year, and none of them the shelter cluster globally responded to. So, you know, I think part of the answer to that question is how do we, in Indonesia, we say lepas tangan, get comfortable being hands off. How do we give cool, good, clear technical advice and encourage people to act on that? I also, in a way, wanted to answer another question by Dina earlier. I was involved in a project in Jakarta where we sat down. There's a professor in Japan, Maguro Maki, and they have this Maguro Maki disaster imagineering process, which is really, really cool. We sat down with a bunch of businesses in Jakarta and we evaluated their businesses. We helped the Jakarta government draw up an earthquake contingency plan based on best knowledge of what an earthquake was likely to look like. We did the micro-zonation of that, looked at people's individual businesses, and then put them through an imagineering event where they imagined that disaster. And that imagineering event says, okay, it's a minute after the disaster. You know, that you're sitting in your office on a Tuesday, it's a minute after, what will you do? This is going on. It's that evening. Staff want to go home. What will you do? It's next week. You know, everything around you is still in case. What will you do? And we talk them through like this, and then we get them all the way back to the point where they're trying to think about reconstruction. Then we stop, have a break, and we bring them back the other direction. We say, okay, it's a minute before the disaster. What would you do? It's a day before the disaster, or an hour before. What would you do? It's a month before, or a week before. What would you do? It's a year before. What would you do? And we record all of their answers and we write it back and say, well, here's a disaster resilience plan that you invented. Here's a bunch of actions you said you could do. They're really interesting and they would work. We agree with them. They're clever. Anyway, great doing business with you. Have fun. And we walked away and we came back a year later and we looked at those businesses, and this was the process working with businesses. We could do similar things with households. But because, you know, Maguro Maki says that people can't imagine a disaster, they can't prepare for it, they can't respond to it, they can't reduce risk if they don't really understand it. When we taught people to imagine those disasters, we made it real for people. When the information we were giving was real, then they invested in it. Then they took action. And we saw businesses invest literally millions of dollars in reducing risk. And in reducing risk for their neighborhoods, not just for themselves as well. We pointed out to them that if their neighborhood doesn't recover, they can't recover. So they saw their neighborhood connection as well. So I guess partly I would say, there's this thing there where we could look at, I would come back, we're prone to try to get people to measure people's participation in our plan, in our disaster response program, instead of recognizing we're participating in their disaster, their mitigation program, their recovery program. If we see our role as just a participant, an advisor, a guide, that they own it, that they're liable for it, they're responsible, not us. And then we do our best to give them the information they can in a way that they can understand, in a way that they can believe, in a way they can imagine, then they will take action. And then we don't have to worry about quality control. And I think that's the best way to go. I can answer the reverse question is when we actually have to do quality control. So we design a school or some public building, and we've got a quality control process that we have to implement, and Miyamoto has lots of experience in that. But I'd probably prefer to just leave it with that answer and say, how do we lepas tangan? How do we take our hands off and recognize that it's about supporting self-recovery? And that means about empowering right decision making.
Absolutely. I would just add, I mean, just piggybacking on this importance of enabling, right? And creating that enabling environment rather than simply focusing on the providing. I would say looking at some of these projects more at an urban scale, right? That aspect of replicability becomes absolutely essential. So what are let's say some of the solutions that are potentially being brought forth that the communities can replicate themselves, that they can appropriate and can replicate in different instances. And this has to do, and we've touched upon it, right, on just making sure that we're looking at existing accessible local materials that we are able to leverage on that existing knowledge, and potentially it's about tweaking and enhancing, right, some of these practices, but that we are able to leverage on what's existing. And then the other aspect that becomes critical from our end is really that aspect of co-creation and taking that participatory process, right, in the co-creation process as an opportunity to build capacity, an opportunity to have interventions that truly respond to the needs, desires of the community, and through which they can also understand, right, if we're looking at flood risk mitigation, for example, and the integration of, let's say, nature-based solutions, be it through rain gardens or bioswales or something coming in, right, really having these processes to have the communities understand the benefits and the importance of some of these, but have these also relate again back to larger, or let's say more integrated interventions that do respond to existing community needs, and thus become, right, then essential interventions for them, or essential spaces, right? And they won't become, we know at that point that there's a strong appropriation, that they won't become the next, let's say, dumpster as things move forward. So I would just emphasize, and adding to what they've mentioned, right, and that enabling environment, I would emphasize again, just understanding that aspect of really enhancing and seeking to enhance the replicability side, and that importance potentially of the co-creation, and really involving the community from the get-go to allow that necessary appropriation to happen, as well as enhance capacity where it needs to happen, right, and create those tweaks for that existing knowledge that we can leverage.
Thank you
And
very
I
much.
apologize very deeply. I have to leave. I've got a meeting in Ukraine I have to go to. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all.
Thank you very
good luck
much,
with it all.
Dave, and thank you for all your insight. Thank you. So there is if Adriana is still available for a few minutes, there is a question by Rabindra Adhikari. We have spoken quite a bit about Nepal. So please, Rabindra, if you are able to open your mic. And I hope, Matthew, that the answers that you heard was satisfactory, at least in part. Please, Rabindra, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Rabindra Adhikari from Nepal. So I am pursuing my PhD in stone masonry buildings. So thank you for the interesting presentation. My observation here is, so when we try to design or when we try to assist the vernacular construction, then it needs rigorous calculations, design verification, which is required by the local authorities. And then in all cases, it is not possible or feasible to carry out such type of design to verify those things. And then it is making such type of construction obsolete. People are not adopting because the government is going into a more stringent rule for building code, building permit system, and at the same time, the engineers are not able to justify the strength of those type of construction. And then so the knowledge is being lost, and then such type of construction is being difficult to adopt. So is there any any examples or methods adopted in other areas, or how we can tackle it? So I think it would be important to discuss that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the great question. Yeah, it makes me think, and you're absolutely right. You know, some of these practices are unfortunately getting lost because they're not embedded, right, in local construction codes, and in even, you know, in some cases like insurance won't cover the specific use of certain materials, and that does cause a tremendous limitation. So piggybacking on what America is said in her speech, right, there is a requirement and there is a need to really start embedding some of these into more policy and you know, construction codes. It makes me think of the 1995 earthquake in Colombia, in the Coffee region, which is an area that has a lot of bamboo. Yet, you know, bamboo, what we mostly saw was the vernacular construction built out of bamboo, be it bamboo buildings or wattle and dub using bamboo as a primary structure. And these were honestly the only buildings that were left standing. So after the earthquake happened, right, there was an acknowledgement of, okay, well, this hasn't been included in our construction code for a while. Building with bamboo was actually illegal because it wasn't part of that construction code. What we had was a lot of informal construction using bamboo because, you know, grows like weeds, strong as oak, but it became poor man's timber. So what you would see is mostly the use of bamboo in informal settlements and very also, I would say, poorly built constructions as well, and had led to kind of a stigma of the material. And going back, right, having had the earthquake, having had this impact, and realizing some of this vernacular architecture, 100 years old, still standing after the earthquake, we have to revisit this. And that prompted a whole ignition of both academia, right, with different universities, looking and restudying these materials and actually re-embedding it into the construction code. So Colombia was one of the first countries having a let's say parasismic construction code, including the bamboo. And, you know, we see some of these lessons learned then going over to the Philippines, where they've been able to kind of incorporate bamboo also as part of the construction code. And we know that it's seismic resilient. So there is a need, right? And it's not a direct, it's not a you know, night to morning process. It is a lengthier process, but just to say, there are various examples now around the world where we can go back and look at some of these kind of lessons learned and just make sure that, you know, that there is an understanding that this can happen. And once, and again, it's not an immediate process. It is a lengthier process, because especially if a certain material has gotten forgotten or special construction technique has gotten forgotten, it's not embedded necessarily in the construction code. It does take a while to bring it forth. But I think having, and, you know, Dave mentioned our, you know, alliance with Qatar in Afghanistan, for example, being able to provide kind of those necessary studies that show that these systems actually do work. And what's happening is that potentially there's an evolution of the way that we're constructing that has then forgotten these important details, be it in the bracing, be it in, you know, allowing these floor joists to come out and protrude outside of the wall that give kind of the structure that flexibility. So recognizing these details and having that technical analysis on the existing, but also recognizing, right, and communicating that is important, but also realizing that for a longer term development and sustainability, there is a requirement, a need to hopefully then re-include and re-embed these in a legal manner, right? Have them be part of the construction code, have a familiarization of them, and that is a lengthier process.
Yes, and indeed, in fact, the Nepalese code, seismic code, is one of the few for which, for masonry, it actually gives the specific construction direction for you know, having the cornerstones and many of the things that Dave was highlighting earlier as element of good constructions. The problem is, how do you bring all of this together in the real life of a family that wants to rebuild a house? Yes. Thank you very much, Rabindra. And there is a question from Fatima, which is also very interesting. Fatima, if you want to open your mic.
I'm so terribly sorry. I will also have to excuse myself. We are very happy to be able to respond potentially in written format if that's okay.
Yes, well, yes, we will send you the questions, and we will.
That would be wonderful, and we're happy to respond to any additional questions that come. And again, so honored and privileged to be part of this conversation, and yes, to be able to share some of these experiences with you all. Really appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much for attending and for giving us such interesting presentation, Adriana. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you
Dr.
very much,
Dean.
Adriana.
Thank you, Rafael America. It's a pleasure.
So I think we can close the meeting, Dina. Thanking all the attendees for their participation, for their questions. As Dina was saying, you can send us also questions by email, and we will forward them to Dave and Adriana to answer. Thanks, America, again for joining, for your words, and looking forward to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you all. Bye-bye.